generally. So along those lines, I want to touch on the issues of creativity and the experience of life outside of psychedelic journeys is impacted by psychedelic journeys. And here this relates to a question that I heard a lot when I put the call out on social media that I was going to do this episode. And I asked people, what do you want to know about psilocybin? And one of the more common questions that I got was, does it increase creativity? Does it increase our experience of life in ways that are beneficial, aside from its now documented positive effects in treating depression and compulsive disorders and addiction? And the short answer to this is yes, but that the positive effects of psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, on creativity and our experience of life have only been explored in a fairly narrow set of dimensions. However, where it's been explored, there's some really interesting findings. So one of the more interesting findings, I think, is a paper entitled Increased Low-Frequency Brain Responses to Music After Psilocybin Therapy for Depression. I think this is a really interesting paper because what the authors did is they took advantage of the fact that in these therapeutic psilocybin sessions that were carried out for the treatment of depression, music is being played. And there are prior studies showing that when music is played, you activate different brain areas depending on what sort of music is being played. That's somewhat obvious, perhaps. Sad music versus, intense, you can think about heavy metal versus choir music versus Gregorian chants versus punk rock music, and on and on. It makes sense that different brain areas would be activated when different patterns of music are played. However, there do seem to be some universal features of brain activation in response to music. This should probably be the topic of an entire episode of the Huberman Lab podcast, and indeed it will be. For instance, there are areas of the auditory cortex that are activated, no surprise there, and areas of the brain's reward circuitry, the so-called ventral striatum, and the so-called mesolimbic reward pathway. I talked a lot about these in the episodes about dopamine that I've done previously. These are brain areas that lead to the release of dopamine in other brain areas and that reinforce certain experiences and that tend to give us the subjective feeling of, yes, I like this, I want more. So in this particular paper, what the authors did is they took advantage of the fact that people are in the clinic, they're on psilocybin, they're listening to music, and as you recall, the music played at different stages of the psilocybin journey are different. They have a different emotional component. And music is a really nice stimulus in the laboratory, as we say, because like with visual stimuli, you can break it down into high frequency, low frequency, right? Sounds like doon, doon, or these kinds of things. That was my attempt at low frequency versus high frequency auditory stimuli. Or at the spatial frequency, or what in the auditory domain would be called the temporal frequency. Is it boom, 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 or is it boom, 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 boom? All we've changed there is the temporal frequency. The sound was somewhat the same, but the distance between those sounds was different. You get the idea. So they have access to these people and these different conditions, and they can put them in the brain scanner, and they can do that before and after having taken psilocybin. And the long and short of this study is that psilocybin changes one's experience of music, not just during the psilocybin journey itself, but thereafter. And in fact, it changes one's emotional response to music in very interesting ways. For instance, one of the more common features of major depression is that people don't derive as much pleasure from different types of experiences, whether or not it's food or sex or social experiences, to the point where sometimes they just stop trying to seek out those experiences. People with depression often feel as if music no longer has the same impact. It just doesn't really lift them up very much. This study found that people who have taken psilocybin, according to the parameters we talked about earlier, can get a return of the elevated emotionality, the positive emotions associated with music that formerly made them feel good. In other words, they can feel music again. They can feel good in response to music again. Now, this is interesting because in theory, it could be that psilocybin simply allowed them to access the emotions around music again more generally. But that's actually not what this paper and some other papers that have been published report. Rather, it seems that taking psilocybin can increase one's positive perception of music that one likes and can tone down or reduce the depressiveness or the sadness of music that tends to make one sad, even after the psilocybin has worn off and for a long period of time afterwards, maybe even forever, although No study, of course, can be carried out forever because forever is forever. What we do know, however, is that psilocybin can rewire the connections between the emotion centers in the brain and the networks that control auditory perception of music, and leads to this condition in which people who felt like I was depressed or I couldn't feel the music, I just wasn't getting the same lift and joy from it again, they can start to experience more joy from that music again. And that music that made them feel sad and depressed has a diminished capacity to make them feel sad and depressed. And there's a lot of neuroimaging data in this paper that point to the specific brain areas that include areas like the ventral tegmental area that can explain why these sorts of effects would occur. So this isn't just subjective reports of people saying, oh yeah, I was depressed and music didn't feel really good and now it feels great. Or that used to make me feel so sad and now I feel like I have a capacity to listen to that without being, crushed by feelings of sadness. The paper included some subjective reports of that sort, but then was able to link those to changes in brain circuitry and brain activation in response to music using neuroimaging. So in that way, it really points to both the subjective and structural and functional changes that psilocybin can bring about through that expanded connectivity between brain areas. Because remember, during the psilocybin session, it's not as if music or the perception of music is specifically being looked at or focused on in these studies. Rather, music is playing. People are in the eye mask. They're feeling all sorts of things. They're breathing, they're hearing, their touch. It's all happening all at once. There's a peak. It's long. There's a long taper. The music's changing. Okay, all of that took place in this study as well. But it is after the session when comparing brain activation states to music of a particular type, sad or happy, and comparing that to the patterns of brain activation that occurred before the psilocybin journey, that they discover that people's brains have rewired during the psilocybin session in a way that allows them to experience joy in response to music again. So that's one of the more rigorous studies I was able to find that addresses this question of whether or not psilocybin really does rewire the brain in ways that allows us to be more creative and experience life differently after the psilocybin